Hi everyone, it's Laura and I hope you're all doing really well. Today I'm going to be talking through the books that I read in the second half of October. So I've already done a reading wrap up for the first half of October, which I'll link here and in the description box below if you'd like to catch up on what I've been reading this month. I've actually read loads of books in October for me. I mean, probably for other booktubers it's like, what is this tiny number that you have read? But I've read 10 over the course of October, which is like bang on track for like my target for what I'd like to read in a month. So that's made me very happy. So I've got 5 books to talk to you about here today, and they're all quite interesting ones, I think. So let's start with the biggest bad boy that I read, which was The Testaments by Margaret Atwood. So this has been everywhere, obviously. This is a sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, and it jointly won the Man Booker Prize. I mean, it's been like the best-selling book ever, I think. I'm making up figures, that might not be true, but you would probably have to have been living under a rock to not know what The Testaments is. So what I'm saying is there was a lot of hype behind this book. So I went into it with a little bit of trepidation, because I feel like when a book is very hyped up, my automatic reaction is to be like, oh, well, it's probably not that good, I don't want to read it. But I'm glad I read this though. This book takes place, I want to say, about 16 years after the events of The Handmaid's Tale. So if you're unaware, The Handmaid's Tale takes place in a dystopian future within what used to be the US, where the fertility rates were extremely low, and so this very traditional patriarchal violent society has taken over, and all fertile women are forced to be handmaids, where they are ceremoniously raped in order to try and create children, essentially. And this book, rather than being from Offred's perspective, which The Handmaid's Tale is told from 3 different perspectives. You have Aunt Lydia, who's one of the sort of women training all of the handmaids, a young girl who's been brought up in Gilead and this is all she knows of life, and another young woman who's over the border in Canada. So you're seeing the juxtaposition between both of their upbringings and their childhoods. I really loved The Handmaid's Tale when I read it. I do feel like I probably should have reread it before reading The Testaments, because the exact reading experience is a little bit hazy in my mind and has been taken over by the television show, and so that's kind of what I imagine when I read this now. And for me, this did fall a little bit short of what my expectations for the book were, but only because I think I have watched the TV show, and this felt less like a sequel to The Handmaid's Tale, the book, and more like a sequel to the TV show, in a way that if you hadn't seen the show, I feel like more aspects of the plot in this book would be cleverer, or would be more interesting or more revelatory to you. But if you have seen the TV show, I feel like it's like, oh, these are just characters from the show, and it feels like it follows on in a way that to me seemed quite lazy. So although I did enjoy the overall experience of reading it, this did remind me more of The Year of the Flood, some of Margaret Atwood's other writing, than The Handmaid's Tale, actually, where it jumps between different perspectives. And I enjoyed that because I enjoy Margaret Atwood's writing. I didn't feel like the plot seemed very interesting to me, although I have spoken to my friend who hasn't seen the show at all, and he had a really different perspective on this book than I did. I think one of the things we discussed was how in The Handmaid's Tale it feels very violent and very about the sexual violence and the threat, and the kind of sense of hopelessness that Offred feels. And in The Testaments, it does feel like it focuses more on how the society came about. It looks at the complexities of different people's characters, especially a character like Aunt Lydia, and how she enabled this society in order to protect herself. But I do feel like the overall merits of this book have been quite overshadowed by the hype surrounding the marketing of it, the fact that Atwood won the Booker Prize in a joint fiasco with Bernardine Evaristo, which I personally disagree with. I feel like almost takes away from this book just being a very clever and very enjoyable read, and it definitely did detract from my reading experience. So I'm finding it quite difficult to review or to recommend to you to pick up. I think if you love The Handmaid's Tale, if you're really into Margaret Atwood, absolutely, definitely read this. In fact, I'd probably recommend you read this more if you're not really into the TV show, because I feel like this will give you a very different perspective on the original content of The Handmaid's Tale. But, I mean, do I think it should have won the Booker Prize? No, I don't. but I've not read anything else on the shortlist from this year, so I can't really make that judgment call. That was such a weird rambling rant / chat about that book. I'm sorry. I'm going to get onto some books that I did really enjoy and have much more definite views about. So the first one of these is Hollow Heart by Viola de Grado, which I read because it's one of my Europa editions. This was the first Europa edition I think I've read, apart from some of Elena Ferrante's standalones, where I really loved it. So I'm very, very surprised by this book. This book follows the story of a young woman's suicide. So before I get into the content of it, there's obviously a huge trigger warning for issues of suicide. Especially because this book is actually quite graphic and quite visceral and physical and very descriptive. And the first kind of chapter or two, when I read it, she's recounting how she committed suicide and what it was like. And I was reading it feeling like, this is actually really unsettling. And the language is quite graphic. It's not mournful and it's not sad, but it just feels like, it feels quite shocking. And then as it goes on, we're sort of following her after she's dead. And she spends a lot of time as this kind of ghost with her body and describing her body decomposing. So like, that is a huge thing to get over. And if that's something that makes you feel squeamish in any way, 100% would not recommend this book. But for me, I felt like it was almost quite transformative as I was reading it. She is very funny, in an extremely dark and dry way, obviously, but we're sort of following this young woman. She's describing her sort of childhood, her relationship with her mother and her aunt and her family, her wider family, her relationship with an ex-boyfriend. And you don't really quite, it's not like she gives reasons for why she committed suicide, because obviously there tend not to be reasons. It's more just an examination of what her life was like beforehand and what her life is like now that she's dead. And it's the kind of thing where when I got to the end of it, it really made me appreciate life. Like, she's talking about missing touch and senses of longing or being hungry or being tired or whatever it is. And it's almost like she's going mad as this ghost. It's really difficult to describe, but by the end of it, I really loved it. And her descriptions of decomposition, I was like, yeah, this is fine. It's like I got used to it, and thought, yeah, this is quite a useful book to make me confront death in a way and make me appreciate everything that I have by being alive. So a very weird one, and I wouldn't recommend it to everybody, but if you feel like that's something that intrigues you at all, I would just say, you know, her writing is really it makes it really worthwhile. She's written one other book called 70% Acrylic, 30% Wool. So I will be 100% getting that now, and looking forward to seeing what else she writes. Next, I picked up one of my Persephone books, and the one I read was Young Anne by Dorothy Whipple, and I have heard many a good thing about Dorothy Whipple, so I'm really pleased that I finally got to this one. This is just, I don't really know how to describe this book other than delightful. It was just nice, a really cosy read. This is about a young woman called Anne, funnily enough, and we're following her childhood and her life into young adulthood. And she is living around the time of sort of Edwardian period and then First World War. And it's one of those books where there doesn't feel like there's a lot of plot. It's not written in that modern way where sort of every single scene has to then follow through to something interesting about the character later on. It's more closer to sort of a book which just follows someone's life, and it's like, and then next year this happened, the next year this happened. It doesn't necessarily follow together, but some of the wider themes are that of class and status, and also how the First World War kind of turned that all on its head. It's about her friend's cousin who's from a much lower class family than they are, and she falls in love with him, and it's just nice. It's just nice to read. Her descriptions of some of these ridiculous family members kind of reminded me of Jane Austen, like with the Bennets in Pride and Prejudice. There's some people who really want to think that they're upper class and trying to get on in life, and are being quite silly about it. But you do get a sense of Anne's boredom, I suppose, and her indecision. She doesn't know what she wants to do, who she wants to be, and that kind of follows as she floats through this book. Not really sure where her life is going to take her. So overall, I enjoyed it. It's one of my more favourite Persephone books that I've picked up. Next, a book I'm quite annoyed about because I really wanted to like it and I really I really didn't like it at all. That's Keeper by Jessica Moore. This is out in January, so this was a proof. I don't know if it's Keeper or The Keeper. There's sort of different things online about what the title of this book is. But it's about a young woman who works in a women's refuge who is found dead. And we're unsure whether it's suicide or whether it was murder, because some of the women who worked with her in the refuge think she may have been killed. And we're following the police who are investigating this death. It jumps between now and then is the story of her meeting this guy and starting a relation, like essentially an abusive relationship with him. But you see kind of the inception of that relationship and how it grows. And then that's contrasted with the police who are trying to investigate what's going on and talking to the other women in the refuge who all have their own stories and also different ideas about Katie, but also about men and relationships. Sort of everybody has their own perspective. Now that sounds like a really good, interesting book. It's just written really badly, and I found it so difficult to get through because I had to know what happened, because the idea of the book I love. Even the little things that she picks up on, like Katie laughing at somebody's joke, which isn't funny, but she's like, oh, he paused expecting people to laugh, so I laughed. And it's just those kind of interactions between men and women, the little things that don't seem like very much, don't seem like something you could complain about, and how they build into something worse and worse. That was all done, that was all handled brilliantly, and I found it very interesting. I wanted to know what happened. I was really kind of drawn into everybody's stories, but the characters didn't feel very fully developed. There was so much exposition, I actually couldn't deal with it, especially when you get into the women's refuge and she's introducing all of those characters. It felt quite sloppy, although there were real aspects of people's interactions which I thought were so well observed. So I think there was so much potential in here, but it just wasn't executed very well, and that really breaks my heart. And finally, I read some non-fiction, which I really, really enjoyed. So you may remember earlier in the year, Jean and I read, or actually was this last year? I can't even remember now, but we read Trainwreck by Sadie Doyle for the Feminist Orchestra, which is all about the concept of a woman being a train wreck. So someone like Amy Winehouse or Britney Spears, like going off the rails. And she's written a new book called Dead Blondes and Bad Mothers. And this was great. I think if you enjoyed Trainwreck, you would really like this as well. What she's focusing on in this book is more about the concept of a woman as a monster, which sounds a bit odd. From the blurb, I couldn't quite work out what it was she was trying to get at, but she's looking at sort of horror tropes and how women feature in all of these different stories across culture. So she looks at different stages of a woman's life, like being a daughter, going through puberty, being a wife, being a mother, and how those roles are kind of portrayed in different horror films, in books and stories. She'll look at Dracula, for example, or Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein, and then she also looks at real life situations. So some of the things I thought were really interesting is when she looks at violence. So she'll look at like a slasher movie and this concept of the final girl in a horror movie where dead blondes, where lots of like teenagers or whatever are being killed either because they're being quite sexually active or slutty or whatever, and they're the ones that get killed, but there's normally one girl left over from the serial killer's rampage. You'll look at films like Scream or Final Destination, and talks about this fascination with like sort of brutal killings of beautiful young women. And then on the other end of it, she'll look at the real life situation, the real life killer who inspired films like Psycho and Silence of the Lambs, and how his relationship with his mother was massively drawn upon in books about his life. And obviously when you look at something like the film Psycho, where the character's relationship with his mother is extremely unhealthy, that has all been inspired by a real relationship. But the actual truth or the actual facts about this woman are so sort of mild or slim. There's no real evidence at all that she was some kind of crazy abusive mother, but because her son was a killer, it's almost like you then end up blaming her. So she's looking at the concept of being a bad mother creates a serial killer. So either women are monsters in and of themselves, or if their sons are monsters, that's still the woman's fault. It's really fascinating, and I can't kind of take out all of the things she's talking about this book in this video because it would just go on for too long. But I love the way she looked across like so many different examples of like real life horror, ghost stories, stories about possession and exorcisms, and kind of how that mirrors the different changes in a woman's body as she grows up. I found it really interesting and a really, really quick read as well. I was so into it, I couldn't put it down. So I hope that was interesting. I'd love to hear from you if you read any of these. Tell me if you've read The Testaments or The Handmaid's Tale. Tell me in the comments below what you thought of it. I would really love to hear, because I think there's some very different opinions around that book. I would love to hear from you as well if you've read any of these, of course. Let me know if there's any that you fancy picking up, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!